Josh is here. We have a party of
Hello.
two. How'd it go?
It went well. I
Good.
was much more nervous this time around. I don't know why. Um, but TJ's cool and said I
Yeah.
passed, I think.
Yes, they have to give you a clear answer as to whether
Okay,
you did or not. So it sounds like you did.
wonderful.
Sergey's here too, and if they don't, then I'll be cross with them because that's also like that's a bad time for you if you're like, I don't know,
I'm in
'cause-
limbo.
especially because you're more likely to like self-select as like that was terrible, and then
Fair
wonder
enough.
what your future is like. Hey, Sergey, were you able to get the cocoon gem situated or?
Uh, I didn't have a chance to work on it yet.
Gotcha, because you do like late night coding too, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha. I just figured I'd check in. Who did use Cocoon? Did you use Cocoon, Josh? No, somebody did. I have to try to remember.
You have another idea? I will try that first. I don't know if that's correct, but I will try to create cocktails ingredients and assign them ingredient ID and create them. And inside my private method, I'll try to, after create them, like check the last 5 and see if they don't have ingredient ID, try to delete them.
Got it. Okay. I think that's fair. Well, I wish you the best of luck. I know it's been rough with these nested forms with some of you guys. Oh man.
What
Okay,
is Cocoon?
I think it's a gem that it was, I don't know if he ended up using it. It was Victor. It's like a gem that helps with dynamically adding like nested fields to your form. So like let's say you had nested attributes, but you wanted the user to kind of like add or remove them as needed. So like you didn't always have 5 and then have to deal with empty stuff. So then you could dynamically add or delete them. I think that's what it does, right, Sergey?
Interesting.
Cool. So I don't know if that's what Victor ended up using, but that's who I was thinking of. We're going to get started. If it's a party of 3 of us, great. Sucks for everybody else because it's actually super important stuff that we're talking about today. It's also like thorny in some aspects. If it is a small group, then we can kind of like pause more on your questions, but I'm going to charge forward. So JavaScript is weird, right? It's funky. So we're talking about funky JavaScript fundamentals today. That's the goal. Cool, right? So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is stuff that gets asked in the Mod 4 assessment and in technical interviews. It's not like the most obscure stuff in JavaScript because JavaScript has its fair share, more than its fair share of weird stuff, but it's going to be stuff that tends to come up fairly often. It's commonly asked. And then students tend to get to their Mod 4 project and they forget all of this stuff. And they're like, I remembered learning this, but now it's dropped out of my head. So I'm giving you that warning, that heads up. Like you've already seen the way they introduce this in the curriculum, like JavaScript has stuff. I don't really love the flavor they give this section. I have strong negative feelings about it, but they don't put me in charge of these things. But they kind of try to introduce it in a unique way. But JavaScript is like any coding languages in that it has things that make it up. It has data types, right? So in JavaScript, we've got what? I think we have strings, numbers, Booleans, undefined, null, arrays, and objects, something like that. So you should know what they are and you should know their truthiness, but like that's not the point of today's conversation, right? You can also manipulate all of those things, right? So you can do things with strings, you can do things with arrays. A lot of the times you just have to have a sense of what you're trying to do and you can kind of Google as you need to. So like, how do I do X, Y, and Z with arrays in JavaScript, for example, right? So again, we'll touch on some of that stuff as we need to here, but it's not really the focus on like of today's conversation because that's what the curriculum kind of already spells out for you. Hey, Thomas. So let's start with variable declaration, right? You guys are probably all coming from different places. Some of you might have no JavaScript experience. Some of you probably have at least a little. So we're going to kind of try to meet in between and make it more like I'll ask you a question and I want some feedback about what you think versus me talking for an hour about JavaScript stuff, right? So just like in Ruby, you can declare variables in JavaScript. The rules and behavior just tends to be a little bit different, right? So what I'm looking for you guys is what do you know about how to declare variables in JavaScript? Anything you got?
Does it have to include var in front of it?
So that's one way to declare variables in JavaScript. So one way to do so is with var, right? Can you tell me anything about var?
Just that it's used to declare variables.
Okay, that's fine. Like I said, I'm more feeling to see what people know already. Cool. Yeah. So a good rule of thumb. So first off, you have another way of declaring variables that's called const, right? And Thomas has a great point, which I'll try to drill into you guys. There are a lot of ways to do things in JavaScript. Some of them are more outdated. Const and another type called let are newer. They were introduced in ES5, I think. And a good rule of thumb is try to use const or at least let. You shouldn't be using var. I can't think of a good reason why you would, and we'll talk about why var is actually super confusing. That's going to be a large part of today's conversation. But basically, yeah. So var is older, right? You use let if you want to reassign things. So if you use let, it will let you reassign variables, whereas const will not let you. No reassignment. We can pretend I spell things right? So var will let you do both of those things, which is one of the reasons why it's funky, right? There's one more way of declaring variables in JavaScript. Anybody know? You should probably never do it, so I'm okay with you not knowing it, right? But basically, you can declare global variables by just kind of doing something like name equals whatever, right? But unless you have a good reason for doing that, and I can't think of any, you shouldn't. But if you declare a variable without any kind of keyword beforehand, that's a global variable declaration, right? So those are the 4 ways that we can declare things in JavaScript. So what are the major differences? So we talked a little bit about reassigning, right? There's also like whether or not you can redeclare a variable. So we'll say that var will let you do a lot of weird stuff that will bite you later. So it will let you redeclare the same variable with the same name later on, right? That's a recipe for bugs. So in a lot of ways, when we're using let and const, we're trying to protect us from ourselves so that we don't get a bunch of weird use cases and behaviors. Okay, cool, right? Now, we're gonna talk about something funky, right? Before we get too into the nitty gritty, you should understand that like when we're, let's say, parsing a JavaScript file, it happens in 2 phases, right? At a simple level. Anyone know what the first phase is called for a program running through a JavaScript file? It's okay if you don't. It's called the compilation phase, sometimes the creation phase. Some of the weird stuff that we're going to talk about now, like, depends on what happens in that first. Yeah, so Thomas says allocation, right? So basically in that first stage, variables are declared and given some space in memory, and sometimes they're initialized with variables, or not with values, sorry, right? So we're going to talk about something called hoisting that is related to that first phase, right? So basically during that first phase, just microseconds before your code actually gets executed, right? It's scanned for what we call function declarations and variable declarations, right? And then it's like taking those declarations and putting them in memory, right? Sometimes those variables that get declared are initialized with a value, even if it's just undefined, and that can lead to some strange behavior later. So that's kind of going to be what we're focusing on for this first part. Right? The second phase is the execution phase, right? That's when the actual like real values are assigned to variables. So they're initialized with whatever you wanted them to be in that file, right? We'll start with some simple examples, right? So we can do something like this with var, right? There's nothing earth-shattering about this, right? It shouldn't be surprising to anyone that this is valid code. We can run it, right? And we get Bob. Right? That's pretty familiar to us. I would say like get in a habit of when you declare a variable, giving it a value, right? It's a lot easier to read your code if you declare things with values, and you're less prone to like run into weird bugs, right? Now, what I want to know is what happens if I do this. What do you think would happen if I ran this code?
It would break because no, name would still be Bob, but then var name would be bad.
Name would still be Bob, but then var name would be bad. What do you mean?
Because name would still be declared as Bob, right? But as a global variable.
See,
So never do this. That's not right.
yeah, I don't know how to explain why that's not what happens, because I was thinking about that today. I was like, somebody's going to ask me that. I should have known it would be you. That's not actually what happens. When we run this code, JavaScript's cool with it, right? Does anyone know why this works in JavaScript? Because we can't do this in Ruby. You can't refer to variables that haven't been defined yet.
Is it because it's storing like name as a label with a value, and then later just saying like, hey, by the way, that label corresponds to a variable?
Yes, basically, right? And this is often what we call hoisting, right? So there's a lot of jargon that's used to talk about this, and I've kind of fluttered around what's the clearest way to talk about it. But it really is, in essence, what you said, Thomas. The first time the program is read, like when we get to this, like the first stage is just declaring things in memory and giving them values in some cases. So when we get to this var name, it gets declared in memory and it gets initialized with a value of undefined, right? But then on the second pass, it gets the real value, right? And that's able to run just fine. Right? Sometimes people visualize this as if the code is physically being hoisted up. So you'll sometimes see that in like tutorials. I shared a article this morning that says that like that's not what's happening, but it's more about that variable kind of being registered and initialized with some value. So it's still recognized as something that exists, right? So that's what we call hoisting, right? So this works just fine, right? And this is a thing that you must know. It's a weird thing with var. So they say it's taking a pass through your code and it hoists the declaration to the top of what we call the lexical scope, which is basically like a way of keeping track of what scope we were in when that variable was declared, right? So that happens with var, and then on the second pass, it assigns the real value, right? Now, let and const, in a simple sense, they're not hoisted, right? Really, the true answer is more complicated than that. I was doing some reading this morning. When you get into your assessment, it would be totally fine to say that let and const are not hoisted. That's a good enough answer, but it's really an oversimplification. Really, any kind of declaration, whether it's let, var, const, I think classes and function declarations, they're all technically hoisted in the sense that they're being declared, but they may not necessarily be initialized with a value, right? So let and const, this is kind of funky. They get declared, but they don't get given any value. So there's a term for this. It's called the temporal dead zone. So they're just kind of hanging around and we can't use them before they're defined. We get thrown an error, right? And we'll see some examples that kind of flesh that out a little bit. So if you want a nice, easy answer, let and const are not hoisted. If you want kind of an impressive answer, you can say, well, not in the simple sense, but X, Y, and Z, right? So again, those articles I shared this morning go into that in like super intense detail, right? And again, it's easy to forget some of these differences by the time you get to your assessments, and also because like you're probably not going to use var much in the curriculum because you shouldn't, right? But you should be aware of some of the weird stuff that var does, because that's why we have let and const now, to get around some of those, right? So I think we talked about some of this already, weird things that var will let you do. It will let you redeclare the same variable. So I can do something like var name is Bob, and then redeclare it. Like JavaScript has no issue with that, right? But to me, that's confusing to read, right? And if you're doing a bunch of that in your code, it's probably going to bite you with a bug later on, right? Now, let won't let you redeclare the same variable, right? So if we go through and run this, can I redo this? Sometimes Replit is weird. If it's super weird, we'll just go into a console. Not a big deal. Okay, cool. So what were we doing? We were doing weird stuff with let. So we said but name, and again, even then I would like declare things with variables, but just for argument's sake, we're going to declare it and then assign it a variable. And then we can redo that, right? And we get an error, right? Because let doesn't let you re-declare the same thing, right? So you get that variable has already been declared. That's the kind of error you get, right? And then with const, right, not only can you not redeclare with const, but you also can't reassign. So I think I'll do this in 2 phases. So if we were using const, right? So 1, you can't reassign. Actually, will this let you do it? I might have to do something like this. Mary, you'll get an error about, there we go, right? Assignment to a constant variable. You're trying to reassign it, right? You also can't redeclare, so you can't do something like const name is Bob, right? So really the punchline is that it's protecting us from some of the weird stuff that you could get yourself into with var, right? Cool, right? Now, one thing that's a little bit funky that actually took me a little while to get comfortable with as a student is that just because you can't reassign a value doesn't mean that you can't change it in some way. So like the most common use case with this is working with arrays. So sometimes students have a misconception that if I store an array in a constant, right, I can't change it because supposedly constants mean that I can't redeclare that variable, right? It doesn't mean it can't change though. What I can't do is something like this, const r equals literally anything else if I made it banana, right? That's not something I can do. I can't I guess I should have done it as reassigning it versus redeclaring it, right? But I can't try to totally reset that value. It's like not acting right today. I think it's just the same error, right? This says assignment to a constant variable. I can still change this though, right? So for example, just like in Ruby, right, in JavaScript, there's a push method. It has the same behavior. It's got a different return value, but I can use it to add things to arrays, right? And that's totally fine. I'm not reassigning the value. I'm just changing what's actually stored inside. It's just not playing nice today. We'll just go into a console, I guess. Nice thing about JavaScript, you can do it anywhere. There we go. It's not as nice for viewing, but we'll make it work. How do I don't know if I can make that bigger. That should be good enough. Cool. Right. So now we're gonna play a game of what will this do, right? Even if you're not sure, try to get in the habit of sort of running through these mental exercises when you're predicting what your code will not necessarily return, but like what it will output, because that's often the flavor of question you'll get asked about this stuff in your assessment and in reviews, right? So what we're gonna do, although I really didn't want to do this in the console, but that's all right, is Joe. Can you guys see this, or is this like way small?
It looks good.
Looks good. Okay, so we're declaring a name, right? I'm going to declare a function. It's called a function declaration. It's kind of an older school syntax. You start with the function keyword, you name your function, you pass in an argument, and then you're going to get more than your fair share of curly braces in the next 2 mods, right? But it's going to console.log a string, right? I'm going to do some interpolation here. In JavaScript, you have to use what we call template literals, which mean that you're working with backticks because normal string quotes don't support template literals. They're like a newer feature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say hello, right? And then the actual template literal is similar to in Ruby, but it's a $sign rather than a hashtag, right? And then whatever I want going on here, right? And then I'm going to, right, because a function is just a set of instructions, just like a method is. It doesn't do anything until you invoke it. So I'm going to do that by referencing the function by name, right, and passing it a name, right? What would you expect this to output when I run this code? throwing you a softball. I didn't catch that.
Hello, Joe.
Yeah, it's just gonna say hello, Joe. I like brain fart. I was like, how do I run the code? It's just gonna say hello, Joe. And we get undefined because the value of a console.log is undefined, and also functions by default return undefined, right? So that one's fairly easy. But what if I, see, and this is where it's gonna get sticky because the console doesn't like when you, sometimes it's weird with cons, but I think it should be okay with let. But let's see, we're gonna start like a fresh context here. So then if I go back here and I clear all this stuff, if I do let name is Joe, and then I redeclare, should have copy pasted it, that's all right. Let function, okay, still the same console.log, name, but then, oh, that's the one that I just did. I want to not have this here yet. Right. What will this code do when I run it? Other than throw an error because I can't spell.
It'll still say hello, Joe.
How sure are you?
A little bit, because the first phase will declare all the variables and functions, and then the next phase will actually put out say hello.
Yeah, you're right. So if I run this, right, I guess in this case, I changed it from what I had. It doesn't say hello anymore. It just does the name, right, and my copy pasting, right? Why does this work?
Because of hoisting.
Tell me more.
It's the first pass in JavaScript of declaring all the variables and functions in the code.
Yeah, and specifically, so function declarations, when we write functions this way, they're hoisted, right? So similar to var, they get hoisted. So it's totally okay to refer to this function by name before we've actually defined it, right? Because it does get declared in memory. Cool. 10 points for Gryffindor, right? So if you remember nothing else, right? Declarations with var get hoisted and function declarations do, right? That's hoisting in a nutshell, right? Questions about that? I really want to get this to work more nicely.
I have a question.
Go for it.
I just joined halfway through, but if you declare a variable within a specific function, well, I mean, that's kind of like a matter of scoping, right? As opposed to
Yeah, it's also related to, so we talked about this briefly, lexical scope, like
yeah, you can like access certain variables within a function, like from another function, you cannot access the other variables inside another function.
Yep, and we'll talk about the scope chain a little bit later in this study group, but you're totally on the money, right? It's related, right? It's all kind of intertwined, but we'll talk about that more too. Cool, right? Another thing you want to know about functions is that you can do a lot of weird stuff with functions in JavaScript that like you couldn't do in Ruby. So like, for example, Ruby doesn't support nesting methods and other methods. That's not really a thing, right? Whereas in JavaScript, functions are what we call first class objects, which means that you can do pretty much anything with them that you could do with any variable, right? You can pass it as an argument to other functions. You can have it returned from a function, and you can store it in a variable, right? These are all things that you can do with functions in JavaScript, right? So let me try to tweak this so I'm not copy pasting so much. So we've still got our name. We're going to change this to what we call a function expression, right? So I'm going to store this in a variable. I'm going to use let. So I'm going to say let say hello equal this function, right? And I'm going to use an anonymous function. An anonymous function is where we use kind of this function keyword, but there's not a name right after, right? And I'm still going to console.log, but I'm going to change it back to what I had before, where it was like hello, whatever the name is. Hello. That looks good so far. Here. Right. And I think I want this down here for right now. Okay. So this should run as normal, like not really any surprises here in terms of like the order of operations when we run this, except that I messed up my syntax somewhere. Let's say hello equals, oh, I still need the parentheses here. It doesn't know what's going on with the braces. I don't know what that is. Oh, that's like weird copy paste stuff. Cool. Right. So this is going to run as normal. There's not really anything like quirky that's going on here, right? But if I were to switch this around a bit and I were to pull this up here, right? What would you expect to happen when I run this code? I'm actually going to clear this so that you're just looking at that and not a bunch of stuff at one time. Come on. Right. What would you expect to happen when I run this code? So will it output a certain thing? Will it throw an error?
I'm gonna say it throws an error.
Yeah, are you maybe you're just feeling the vibe. So I would expect this to throw an error, right? So you should know that function expressions, right, are not hoisted. Function declarations are, function expressions are not hoisted. So again, and I think this is true. So it's not even just a let thing. Like if I tried this again with var, it's, oh, that's not gonna do what I want it to do. We're gonna come back here and hope for better behavior, right? Even if I tried this with var, right, it's still not gonna work. So it's not something particular to let or var in that case. It's still gonna throw an error, although it's not the right error. I don't know, Replit needs to get its game together. Cool, right? So that would still throw an error. So it's not just because I was using let, it's because it's a function expression, right? Does that make sense? So quirks in behavior. Cool, 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 cool. Now, because again, assign the function of a value, blah, 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 function expression.
Man, I'm sorry, Dominique.
Yeah.
What? So wait, why is that throwing an error again?
So this throws an error because this is something that's called a function expression. When we're storing a function in a variable like this, function expressions are not hoisted, which means in the first pass through, right, this variable, say hello, is not being given like, it doesn't know that it belongs to this function. It hasn't been defined yet. So I can't reference it on this line here, right? Whereas if I were using a function declaration, which is kind of the old school syntax where you just have it like function and then the name of the function, right? These get hoisted, which means even though I have it defined down here, I can still use it before it's defined. So if I run this same code, I don't get that error that it's not a function, right? Because this is something that gets hoisted, whereas function expressions don't get hoisted.
Okay, okay.
Right. So it's just kind of a funky thing. Really, for your sanity, you want to not use var in the first place. You want to not be using things before you've declared them. Like you, in general, a good rule of thumb is to declare variables and things at the top of their respective scopes so that you're not running into these weird quirks. But the quirky stuff is often what gets asked about, right? Because you might be working on code that has var still in it for whatever reason, right? So it's good to be aware of the weird stuff. Okay, now, even after all of that weird stuff, we're gonna go back to something a little bit simpler, right? I found, like I worked at Ask a Question for a long time, and I found that often students get many examples with console.log, and so there's confusion around returning, just like in Ruby where you guys see everything with putzing, and then you don't really understand return and how it works, right? So if we're working with functions, how do we return things in functions?
The keyword
Return keyboard.
Yeah, you have to use the return keyword, right? So you have to use explicit returns in JavaScript. In just about every case, I can think of one, like there's a way that you can use arrow functions to implicitly return, but virtually every other time you want to explicitly return. That's going to bite you a little bit as you're transitioning into JavaScript because you're so used to Ruby not making you do that. But more languages than not require explicit returns. So just be mindful of that. But it might drive you crazy at the start. Right? Now, what I wanted to show you real fast is how we would write a function expression as an arrow function. I'm going to use const here because generally we do want to store things in const whenever possible, like Thomas said. It's super easy to turn a function into an arrow function. I actually have it set up pretty close here, but you would get rid of the function keyword. And then after your variable, you have an equal sign. And then after your parentheses, you'd add what we would call the hash rocket in Ruby. I'm sure it's got a funky name in JavaScript. But this is kind of what we're referring to when we talk about these arrow functions, which are either introduced in ES5 or ES6. And they do something called bind this that we'll talk more about later. If you have only one argument, like if we were passing in name here, these parentheses are optional, but in any other case, they're required, right? And then I guess the one thing, since we're here, when we're working with arrow functions, if I wanted to return this, I would need that explicit return like we were talking about before. And this should, oh, see, this is why I don't like working in the console sometimes. Say hello has already been, maybe that's from the previous one. Oh, because it's not hoisted. That's good. That's an error that we would have expected because it's not going to get hoisted as an expression, so I can't use it yet. So I'll just get rid of that piece. But I'm going to go ahead and call it down here like I should. Hello, right? And then we invoke functions with parentheses here, right? It has, oh, because I called it without a name. That makes sense. But in any case, that's how you return explicitly. If you're working with arrow functions and you wanted implicit returns, you can do that. This is going to drive me bonkers. By not doing that. Give one example. One here. One. And then refresh. I'm trying to clear it. Cool. Right? So if you pull this all into one line, you can remove the curly braces and that would be an implicit return. Like you can do it this way. Right? But basically if you have the braces, you need an explicit return. But if you're writing it in one line without it, I think that's the one time I can think offhand of when you can implicitly return, right? Every other time it's explicit. But yes, fat arrow is what I've also heard too. Thanks, Thomas. Okay,
This
cool.
syntax that you're using though with the fat arrow, is that something that's going to be common, or is that just something you were showing us for implicitly?
Oh, well, so I think what you mean is this one line without the braces. That's fairly common. I mean, arrow functions are super common. You should be using them wherever you can. We'll talk more about some of the nuanced differences, but generally when you're working on your projects and like out in the real world, you want to be using ES6 syntax whenever possible. So that means let, const, and arrow functions, right? We're just starting off simple. But yeah, it's definitely what's preferred. There's just some quirks between the two types. We'll see, especially next mod when we're doing stuff with React, there's some weird little differences between when you use one syntax versus the other. So there is a time and a place for either depending on what you're trying to do. And that's its own rabbit hole that we'll get to eventually.
Yeah, I think when we use like a keyword this, we use arrow functions in that case. I'm not sure exactly, but I was just reading through an article.
Yeah, basically they have differences in how they handle this. When you use arrow functions, you bind this. It's kind of a complicated subject on its own. Like there's a time and a place for both depending on what it is that you're trying to do. But they do behave differently around this, right? We're gonna switch gears a little bit to something that's a little less mind-boggling. We're gonna talk about some control flow stuff, right? I think, if anything, that's a concept we've been drilling into you guys since mod 1, like the idea that you want to do things conditionally, right? It's not tricky in JavaScript. It's just a matter of knowing the rules. So I wanted to touch on some more nuanced things, but also some of the basic stuff. So I'm going to start some variable declarations. Num2 is 5, right? So just like you have if statements in Ruby, you have if statements in JavaScript, right? It's the same general concept, it's just a different syntax, and you'll find that the curly braces and parentheses will drive you crazy if you let them, right? Especially when you're working in labs, oftentimes if you're getting a syntax error, you don't get good feedback from the tests, right? It's just kind of complaining about something being wrong, but not super specific. So just be mindful of that, but it's generally just a quick Google away. So we're gonna set up an if statement, right? These parentheses are mandatory as far as I know, but that's where you actually put your condition, right? When we're working with numbers in JavaScript, just like in Ruby, we can compare them. We can see if they're equal, greater than, like those operators for the most part are the same. So I can do something like if num1 is greater than num2, do something, right? I start a block that's gonna have whatever I want to run in that case. So in this case, I'm just gonna log, right? Num1 is greater, right? Just like in Ruby, you can have else if, so some other conditional thing that gets run. If you're anything like me, you're gonna forget whether it's 2 words or 1, whether you need an E or not. It's a quick Google away. But for else if in JavaScript, it's 2 words, right? But then you pass your second condition, right? So in this case, I'm gonna say if num2 is greater than num1, do some other thing, right? Make my life easier. Cool, right? And then you have a fallback, just like you do in Ruby, right? You have an else that doesn't take a condition. Ruby is a little bit nicer about not throwing errors if you misuse these, whereas JavaScript will generally let you know when it's angry. But this is the syntax that you would follow generally. And I'm just gonna console.log, they're equal. Console.log, they are equal. Right? Now, if I go ahead and run this code, like it's pretty easy, you guys would know what would happen because it's the same behavior as in Ruby, right? What's gonna get logged when I run this?
Num1 is greater. No, num2 is greater, sorry.
Yeah, it should be num2 is greater. And thanks for the suggestion, Thomas. I'll look into that. But yeah, Replit is like nice to me unless I'm in a study group and then it's angry all the time, right? So we get num1 is greater, right? Nothing about that is surprising, right? So just like in Ruby, the way this works is that if one of these evaluates to true, the others don't evaluate, right? So I'm not gonna get down here if this is true, right? Similarly, if this evaluates as false, I'll go to the next one and I'll keep looking until something is true. Otherwise, this is my fallback, right? Now, remember in Ruby, probably like you haven't done much with this. I think Josh, you might have used this in your project. Somebody did, but there were case statements, right? Basically another way of kind of getting at this if without having to repeat those, but it was all based on one value. Right? Does anyone know what the like analogous structure is in JavaScript? Yeah, it's a switch statement, right? And I have to Google the syntax for this every single time. We're gonna use this a ton when we get into Redux in Mod 5. And I just wanted to point out like something subtle about it that's different from when you use if and else, right? So I'm gonna start with some setup. So I'm still gonna keep some numbers here. Let num1 is 3, let num2 is 5. And then, right, so I'm gonna declare a variable called diff, because really, I wanna account for 3 different outcomes. You'll see why. But what I'm gonna set this as is whether or not num1 is greater than num2, right? Now this can only evaluate to 2 things. It can be true or false, but I wanna account for when these are the same, right? That's my 3rd outcome that I want, right? So I'm gonna set up an if statement, right? Now my question is how do we ask if 2 things are equal in JavaScript? I I know you probably said the right thing, Puya. You're just breaking up pretty badly for me. But what we would use in like I said, I'm sure he's saying the right thing. I just can't hear what it is. What you would use, we call it the strict equality operator. You use 3 equal signs in JavaScript. If you're not careful about this, you'll drive yourself bonkers. But if I want to ask if these 2 are the same, right, I have to use 3 of these, right? Using 2 of them is a thing. It's called the loose equality operator. I can't think of a good time you would use it, and you're going to get weird results if you do, right? I'm going to share a resource about using those 2 different kinds. But basically, if you're using the 3 equal signs, you're saying, are they actually equal to each other? If you use 2, what JavaScript is basically checking is, are they the same type of thing? So are they the same type of data structure? But then the weird thing is that if possible, it will try to change one of those things so that they are the same. It's called type coercion. So like, for example, you'll see there's all kind of weird stuff in JavaScript where, especially when you're dealing with numbers and strings, JavaScript will try to coerce one type into the other for you, right? So if you remember nothing else about this, use 3 signs for comparing that things are exactly equal, right? And then the 1 equal sign is still for assignment, just like in Ruby, right? So if these are equal, I'm going to set diff as equal, right? And then I'm going to start my switch, right? So we start with the switch keyword, right? And then this is what we're switching on. This is the value that we're asking, is it equal to X or Y or Z or whatever. So this is diff, right? We're going to open a block, right? And then we're going to set up our cases, right? So it's like in Ruby where you said when this, when this, when this, but in this case, it's case true, right? So in the case where this is true, when this is greater than this one, what I want to do is log num1 is greater. Num is greater. Right. And then don't need semicolons. I'm gonna space this out a bit. Does that look right? That looks right. Cool. And then I'll copy this over. My second case will be when it's false. Case false. Num2 is greater, right? And then I also get a default, right? Which I call as default, right? And then I'm just gonna console.log, they're the same. Wish I could show you guys all of this at once. But when I run this, right, given what I have set up here, right, what do you think this will output? What would you expect?
False?
Well, so what it does is it's saying if diff is equal to true, do this. If diff is equal to false, do this. Otherwise, do this, sort of. Right? So it's only ever going to log some combination of these 3 things. Right? And again, I'm sure I can expand this window. I'm not really sure offhand, but if you were like looking at this, num1 is 3 and num2 is 5. Right? Do you guys have any ideas?
It'll just console log num2 is greater.
That's what you would think. But, boy, that's an old one. Right? You actually get 2 things, right? So I mostly wanted to point this out because it's not true when you're working with case statements that if one evaluates to true, the others aren't read, right? It will go through, and if it's true, so like what the heck was it? It was num2 is greater. So like this wasn't true. This evaluated to true because it is false that num2 is greater, right? So then this gets logged, but then nothing by default keeps this from then evaluating. So we got both. If you don't want that, what you would use is a break. So you would say, do this and then break. Don't do these other things. Do this and then break. Don't do these other things, right? So just a small thing to be aware of, right? Questions about that piece? We're good so far. We talked about some number stuff. Let's talk quickly about some other stuff related to working with numbers. So this is something that you guys will do probably a ton. At the very least, you'll do it a few times in this module, but you'll probably working with something like a like button functionality, right? You have a little button that the user clicks on it, like maybe it's attached to an image, and then every time you click that button, you display how many likes that picture has gotten, right? So every time you click it, the number goes up by 1, right? That's a fairly common use case. So you're going to be doing something called incrementing, right? So let's say we declare a variable. Right? I'm going to console.log. Basically, there's 2 different ways of incrementing in JavaScript, and you want to know which one is which. Otherwise, you'll get subtle bugs that can be a little confusing. So one way to do it is this way. Right? Does anyone know when I run this, right, what number gets logged?
4.
How confident are you?
Extremely.
Extremely. How much you want to bet?
25 fake dollars.
Okay, I'll take it. Right? It seems like the smallest thing ever, but basically there's 2 ways of doing this in JavaScript, and it depends on which side you put these 2 pluses, right? If you do it on the right side, what it does is it returns the value and then it increments it. So like if I were to do this again, right, and run it, right? So it returns 3, but then it increments it. So now num is 4, right? It seems like a dumb thing, but it's a thing that you want to be aware of, right? If I were to do it on this side, right, what do you think would happen? Now, we can only imagine so many scenarios, right? Now the thing that we expected, right? So this is the case in which it's going to increment and then return that value, right? The same thing goes if you're trying to decrement. So if you're doing it with minus, right? If you do it on the left side, it's going to return the decremented value. If you do it on the right side, it's going to do the reverse. Or not the reverse, but it's going to return the old value, right? So that's one small thing. It actually like, I think I have another one here. This is the, I know I have a good one on incrementing and decrementing. I'll share that your guys' ways too. Right. Now, similarly, when you're manipulating the DOM, you'll probably find that you have to do either turning a string into an integer or turning an integer into a string. Like for example, maybe you grab how many likes that button has already received, and then you want to do something with that number, right? So in Ruby, it's super easy to do this. You have 2i and you have 2s, right? You have pretty intuitive methods. In JavaScript, it's not hard. It's just a little bit less intuitive. If you want to turn a string into a number, so let's say, for example, I have something like let num is 2, right? You have 2 options depending on whether you want to turn it into an integer or whether you want to turn it into a float, a decimal value. Let me actually try both ways because I'm curious. So if you wanted to parse it into, I always read these backwards. I always think it does the opposite of what it does. But if you wanted to turn the string into an integer, right? There's a method we have called parse int, and you pass it the string. So we're going to pass it num, right? Now, in all practical situations, you're not going to have to do more than that, right? By default, it assumes a base 10 system. So you generally don't have to give it an argument, right? If you ever did, you can specify it as a second one. So like it assumes base 10, but if you had a good reason for using a different number system, you could specify it, right? We also have a similar method for working with floats, which is called parse float. Right?
What is the 10? What did you mean by that?
Got it. So many times we're working with a base 10 system, like our regular base 10 system, right? So like, I have a hard time explaining this, but it's like the numbers we tend to use more often than not. You can have other number systems. So for example, like I think base 2 is a thing, but like in our normal number system, we're working with 10. But there are other number systems that you can use. Probably if you don't have a good reason for doing that, you're just using the default of base 10. Cool, right? Binary is also a good example. Thanks, Thomas. And then if you wanted to do the reverse, if you wanted to turn a number into a string, there's a method called toString. So you can do something like to string is the method you have access to, right? And similarly, it's going to assume something about that doesn't look right. To string, invalid or unexpected token. I guess you can't call it directly on the integer. That makes sense. So if you did something like let num is 2, and then you did something like num to string, and that will assume a base 10 unless you pass something different, right? So there's that case. Now, let's talk about scope, right? When we talk about the general concept of scope, like what are we getting at? This is actually a question I ask when I do Mod 1 assessments. Like, what do we mean when we talk about scope? I appreciate your fun fact, Thomas, that the Mayans use base 5 and Babylonians use base 60. But what's scope getting at?
Like,
All of you have to repeat mods 1, 2, and 3.
scope is like where you can access variables.
Right, that's what it
depending
is.
on where you put it.
Right, so it's where you can access particular pieces of information in your program, right? In JavaScript, it generally comes down to where you declared those variables. We use this concept of lexical scope, right? And in a large part, it's to help protect us from ourselves, so we don't reassign things by mistake, for example, and so we don't have variables conflicting with each other, right? So in JavaScript, scope is determined based on where variables are declared, not when they're used, right? I'll say that again. It's determined on where variables are declared and not when they're used, right? We have 3 different options as far as scope in JavaScript. What are the 3 kinds of scope that we can have? One of them that we talked about already is global scope, right? What other scopes can we have in JavaScript?
Inner and outer.
You're not wrong. It's just a different take on it. Well, because it's kind of comparative, right? You can think about scope as being inner compared to something else. So there's this concept of nesting, right? You can nest scopes in JavaScript, right? So that's a related concept, but it's not one of the 3 categories, right? If you didn't know, which is okay, you have what we call function scope, and we also have block scope, right? And we'll talk about those a little bit more. But those are the 3 different kinds of scope that you can have. And we talked about global already. If you declare things without like a declaring keyword, which you shouldn't do, that's going to have a global scope. Okay, let's start back here. Do a function declaration, reading. Right. So I've declared a variable, right? I've declared a function and misspelled it. And then deleted it. Cool. I'm logging it and then I'm calling my function, right? What scope is this in on line 1?
Global.
Yeah, it's in global scope, right? It's outside of the context of any function or any block, right? So there's no issue with me using it, right? We can reach out but not in when we're thinking about scope, right? Out but not in, right? Now, if I were to change this around a little bit, then I think I want to do this, not this way yet. Down here. When I run this program, I want to know what is going to get logged.
Gonna console.log the name, but the function won't return anything.
Okay, you're right. So the function doesn't return anything, but what I want to know is which name is going to get logged. Sue or Sam. Probably shouldn't have picked the same letter, but they are 2 different names.
It would be Sue.
Okay, what's your reasoning?
Since we're talking about scope, I'm going to imagine that within the function, you can only access Sam within the function, so within those curly brackets. Otherwise, name is always going to be
What context are we in on line 7? Like what scope are we in?
in the global.
We are in the global scope, right? So let's try it out, right? It's going to be Sue. So it's not quite an issue of hoisting, right? We're in the global scope on line 7. So it's kind of like the way that the scope chain works is that you kind of, wherever we're using that value, we're checking to see does that value or does that variable have a value in this scope? And if not, we start to move outward and look for it, right? So we move out the scope chain. So this is global on line 7, right? So we're checking in the global scope first because that's where we're in, right? So that's why it logs Sue. Right? So in terms of addressing what you said, Thomas, so it does get hoisted, but it's not actually changing the scope of this variable, right? So like I could use, the hoisting relates to where, like whether I can do something like access this before it's defined. So for example, I can do something like console.log Sam. Come on. So what are we doing? Name, and then I'll ignore this for a second, right? So this gets hoisted, which means that I can use it before I've actually declared it. And then I can run it, and it logs undefined, but it doesn't throw an error because on this line it isn't defined, right? But it doesn't throw an error like we would here, where this is going to say like, I have no idea what you're talking about when you reference name. That's more of the hoisting thing. So then we're back here. Now, this is going to be the same. We can skip that one. Now, what if we do something like move this up here? We're going to get rid of this other one that we don't need. So if I run this program, right, which name is going to get logged?
And that would be Sam,
What's your reasoning?
because you're calling the function greeting, and greeting makes name Sam and console log name Sam.
Yeah, so like we're console.logging in what scope? What scope are we in on line 5?
The function scope.
Okay, cool. So then we're gonna look in the function scope first for the variable, and we're gonna find it so we don't have to keep looking, right? So I would expect that when we run this, we're gonna log Sam, right? Does that kind of make sense? It's funky. Scope is funky. How are you doing, Shamel? Are you hanging out with us okay?
Yeah, I'm doing good.
You're doing
I'm
okay?
hanging in there.
Who
What
else
I
is
don't
here?
what I don't get was why would you want to declare something before you've defined it, like with the hoisting?
That's a good question. It never really made sense to me. It always
You know what I
seems
mean?
inherently like a bad idea. It's not a
Right.
habit I ever got into. Like I've always been good about declaring things first. But in general, we're protected from it because we're using things like let and constant. It's just good to know that it's a thing that can happen. It's one of the funky bits in JavaScript.
Okay.
Okay, cool. This one works now. Okay, cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little if statement here, right? It's always going to be true, right? Because true is always true. So I'm going to say if this thing is true, I'm going to declare a new variable called Bob. Okay, and I don't think I want to move. All right, I guess I already moved the console.log. I want to do it here. Yes, I want it after the if. Okay, cool. So I want to know what name gets logged here.
I'm gonna go with Sam.
You shot out on me as soon as you gave your answer. You were like, I'm gonna go with psych.
I'm gonna go with Sam.
Okay, we're gonna go with Sam. Any takers for anything different or why?
This feels like a game show.
Yeah, this was like, I feel like it was like 15 minutes of my JavaScript assessment as a student. It's like, why are you torturing me with these mean games? Well, let's see, let's try it first, right? So we get Bob, right? So one thing you should know is that in JavaScript, this is a block, right? It starts with these curly braces, right? Which is separate from the function curly braces, right? Sometimes block scope is a thing and sometimes it's not. When we're working with var, var does not support block scope. So when we get to console.log on this line, we're in the function, maybe I wanted this. We're in the function scope. Okay, yeah, I get it. Okay, so we're in the function scope, right? And var doesn't recognize that this is a different scope because that's not a thing for var. It doesn't support block scope. So to it, this is just another function scoped variable, right? So because these are both declared in function scope and var does this weird thing where it lets us redeclare variables, right? It's gonna go with Bob. So that's why Bob gets used. So it's a combination of var letting us reassign things, but also even though this is a block here, var doesn't work with block scope. It would be different if we were using let, which is one of the reasons why we prefer to use let. If we, I think I'm gonna change all of these, yeah. So if we were using let for both of these, you should know that let and const support three types of scope, all three of them. So they support constant, function, and block, whereas var only supports global and function, right? So now, what do we think will happen when I run this?
Sam?
Yeah, that's right. It's going to log Sam because I'm still in the same context when I call this function or method in this case, right? I'm in the function context. So when we're thinking about scope, it's always out and not in. You can't reach in. And when we're thinking about how JavaScript looks up variables, it moves like sometimes they'll use up and sometimes they'll say out. It always made more sense to me as a student to think of moving outward. But we start in the function scope, right? And we're gonna look in that scope for the variable, and that's what we're gonna use. We're not gonna go to an inner scope, right? So we should log Sam.
And what if instead of let if it was a const, like the first var name equal to Sue, if it was const name Sue and the const name Sam and the const name Bob.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So that's gonna stay Sue, I think. Or
So,
no,
so I'll tell you, well, let's try it first because I don't want to confuse you. I want to like know what it's going to do, and then I'll tell you what I think it's going to do. So it works with, so it doesn't actually throw an assignment error because when we think about const not letting us reassign variables, we mean in the same scope. And this is something that took me a real long time to kind of grasp as a student. Like you might wonder, because we spent like 10 minutes talking about why you can't reassign const, why that wouldn't cause an error. But the reason because these all live in different scopes. They don't conflict with each other. So it's still the same lookup rules. We're in the function scope. So we're gonna look in that scope first and we use Sam.
So it would be terrible practice to name all those name, because they would be in different scopes.
Yes, well, this is more of like my opinion than anything. I try to never reuse variable names, even in this case, but sometimes you might have a good argument for why you're using the same name, or sometimes it might feel convoluted to come up with different names for things. But I'm kind of the mind that like at the very least, you're gonna make your life more difficult trying to keep track of all of these, right? Even though it's not letting you reassign them. This actually is going better than expected. And again, in terms of the let and const and var stuff, you should take away that like let and const are keeping you from being able to willy-nilly do whatever you want with variables, right? It's protecting you from some of that stuff. So that's why they were introduced. You should be using those wherever possible, but by the time you get to your assessments, that's all you've been using, and you're gonna forget some of this funky stuff with VAR. So just keep that in the back of your head. I shared some articles with you guys this morning. They're like not light reading, at least for me. Maybe you guys are smarter than me and you'll just zip through, but you've got a whole mod to kind of meditate on these things and let them sink in. It also comes in waves too. So like, it's good to have a simple understanding. So like var, hoist, let, and const don't, and then to build on that in a more nuanced way, right? Now, let's get super funky. And obviously we're over time. So like, if you gotta go, I'm never gonna be offended. I wanna respect your time. This is getting recorded. But I do wanna talk about closures because they get asked about and they're super funky, right? So a closure is basically a function inside of a function, right? So it's a function that gets declared in some other function. And what happens is it has access to information from that outer function, even after the parent function stops executing, right? It's kind of a weird thing in JavaScript. So I'll give you a couple examples and then we'll wrap. So I'm gonna make a function here called create superpower. And I think this is super simple to one of the examples that is in one of those blog posts. I stole this from Nancy, so I think she stole it from that article, right? So I'm gonna take a function that takes in a superpower as an argument. Super, I gotta be able to move this over. Cool. Superpower, right? Start a function, cool beans. It's gonna initialize with a counter, right? Because again, you're gonna be working with counters a ton here. It seems like a simple thing, but you'll see, right? And then inside of that function, I'm gonna declare another function because functions in JavaScript are first-class objects. You can return them from other functions. You can pass them as arguments. You can store them in variables. So in this case, I'm going to explicitly return an anonymous function, right? That takes in a name. And then I'm going to start its block. And then I'm going to console.log a couple strings because I think the counter aspect is going to help bring home the point for you guys. So I'm going to console.log whoever person's name is. This is their superpower. It's always the simple things where I feel like I'm coding for the first time in front of you guys. But this person's superpower is whatever the superpower is. So that's coming from up here. Is superpower. Power, right? So we've got the superpower coming from the parent function, and the name is coming from this little nested function, right? And then I'm also going to log something about this counter, right? Console.log. Is that what I want to do? Yeah. So we're going to say, what are we calling it? Counter. People have this power. Actually, we're going to increment every time we call it. And we're going to do it on this side because I want to get the updated value, not the old one. This power, right? So that's what I've got going on here, right? I've got this parent function, this counter that gets declared, and then this little function that is going to get returned when I call this function, right? So that's kind of the setup. This is what we would call the closure, this little inner nested function. So what I'm going to do, and I think we kind of have a sense of what this is here. I'm going to call this parent function and store it in a variable. Right, so first let me go ahead and run it, and I'll swap over here. So I'll call that function. We're going to do one for flying. This is called create superpower. It knew exactly what I was going for. And then I'm going to pass it in the power of flying, right? Now, what this returns is a function, because that's what I told it to do, right? Its return value is a function. I haven't done anything to invoke that nested function, right? I totally could do that. So I could call my little function that I've stored in this variable, right? And now I'm going to invoke it with parentheses, and I'm going to pass it the actual name of this person. So in this case, that's going to be, yes, right? And then what is it going to do? It's going to complain about all of the...
Superpower needs to be camel cased inside of the interpolation.
The joy of coding. I appreciate you. So
the syntax errors. syntax errors are literally the worst. Like, it's right there when it says like names superpower is superpower.
Name superpower is. Oh man, I feel like a smart person sometimes. Can you tell me what it was again? Because I thought I heard one thing and then it's a different thing.
So where it says, so inside of the closure, it says names superpower is superpower needs to be camel case like it is in there.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you. I would have been here all day. Okay, we try again, right? So we're running that, so it's registering what I just did. I guess I can't scroll up the way that you can in the Ruby replit, but we're gonna go ahead and do that again where we're calling it. And so now it will let me do things. I guess it just took, no, I guess not. So, okay. Create superpower, and then the superpower was flying, right? And that returned our little function, right? Now we're gonna invoke our function and we're gonna assign it to a person. So this person is Nancy, right? So then we're gonna get that her superpower is flying, right? And we got a little typo somewhere in there, that's not a big deal. And 1 people have this power, right? That's not too surprising. We started with a counter. We said when we return this function, like inside of that function, we're gonna increment the counter, right? Now, if I do this again with another person, right? What would you expect to get logged?
Bob's superpower is flying. 2 people have this power.
Okay. Any other takers? I haven't found a good way of asking questions in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're being set up. I just like to solicit everyone to like tell me what they think. Right? But in this case, you're right. Right? So we have Bob's superpower is flying. 2 people have this power, right? Because the idea is that, like with closures, this inter-nested function, right? It's aware of variables that were declared in the parent function, right? Even after this function is done executing, right? So it knows that it has this counter that started at 0 and it incremented it, and we can keep doing that. So we can even keep doing that. I've never had someone raise their hand in a Zoom, so I don't actually know what to do.
Who's raising their hand?
Well, Thomas raised his hand, and I think I might have rejected
oh,
him.
yeah, Thomas, that trick.
But I don't know what the race. I don't know. I'm sorry if I rejected you, Thomas. It's freaking. Oh, I see. I think he didn't mean to do it, or it responded badly. Adventures in Zoom. So, like, I think, does this intuitively make sense to you guys that if I were to like do it again with another person, like I'm gonna pick Sergey, right? And it would say Sergey superpower is flying. 3 people have this power, right? We kind of get that. Now, what if I make a new call? How do I do this and not screw it up? So I'm gonna make a new power. That's not how you spell psychic. It's gonna spell it like physics, right? Psychic, right? I'm gonna call that function again, the parent function, right? I'm just gonna store it in a new variable because it's for a new superpower, right? So I'm gonna call create superpower, and it's gonna be for a different power, right? And this is for being psychic, right? So again, that just returns a function, just like the other one returned a function, right? Now what I wanna know is when I call this function, I used to be a physics teacher, so now it's stuck in my brain, and also I can't spell, some combination of those 2 things. I'm gonna call that function, and I'm gonna pass it a new person. I'm gonna pick on Shamel because I can, right? What do we expect to get logged here?
So Shamel will be passed on to the psychic as an argument.
Right, so we would expect it would say something like Shamel's superpower is psychic, because that's the one we're passing in here. But what about this second log?
It'll just be 1.
Well, but that's not obvious to everyone though, that it's going to be 1. Well, why is it going to be 1?
Full expression. I mean that's
Yeah, because it's kind of like we're making a second copy of this function, right? So like when we called this function the first time, when we stored it as, what the heck was it? It was flying, right? That closure like knew about that counter that was initialized when that function was called the first time, right? So that's its parent function, right? It's keeping track of that counter. It knows it started at 0. It knows to increment it and to keep track of it. But then when we called it again, it's like a second copy of that function, right? It's being called again and initializing a new counter that now its little inner-nested closure function is keeping track of, right? And we can do that as many times as we wanted, right? So that's some of the funkiness we can get into with closures, right?
So because it's assigned to a psychic variable, it's like a, as you say, it's a copy. It's a separate process.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Perfect, right? So that's closures in a nutshell, right? Really, it's a way of taking a copy of that function, but also copying like the scope of that function. So like we kept track of this like variable that was in the parent scope, and we're then able to use it into that closure. So we have access to that outside variable from the parent, and like we're keeping track of it in that inner function, right? And again, I shared an article about closure too. I still feel like depending on the day, I either get it or don't get it. Sometimes they're just weird concepts, so it'll get easier as you're like going through and practicing, right? I guess one thing I wanted to point out, or I guess, yeah, I think I'll pick one of the two things that I had left. So another way we can work with functions is doing something called an immediately invoked function expression, which kind of means what it sounds like. You can actually call a function right after you declare it. Let me give a quick example of that. We're actually going to use the same one. So like you guys saw, let me clear this for a second. I probably should have done that, but that's all right. I'll do it here so I don't have to keep repeating, right? But when I do create superpower, or I'm going to pick a new power, we'll say X-ray vision. What does this return based on how this function is structured? What's the return value of this function? What does it return?
X-ray vision superpower is.
It's actually not quite that, because remember, the whole idea is that this returns a function, right? I can then invoke it and do something with it like we did before. So like I called the function and I stored it in a variable and then I invoked it with parentheses. I can do that immediately if I want to, right? Just by adding another set of parentheses here. So I could go ahead and add the name of the person, right? So I could say Huya, right? And I can run it just as I did before, right? Now, I think I somehow deleted that other console because I have a gift, but we saw at least it was able to console.log it. I actually really need for that other thing to be there to show what I'm trying to show you guys, but at some point I deleted it.
That's
there
your
we go.
superpower.
Yeah, that's my superpower, is making typos apparently. When you use immediately invoked function expressions, you can't do closures with that. So we'll find that like if I called this, like I get the 1 the first time, but then if I tried it again with a different person, we're going to see it's back at 1 again. So you can't do closures with immediately invoked function expressions. Who didn't I get? I think I haven't gotten Josh, and I didn't get Thomas, but he's not here anymore, right? So it will still be 1 again, right? So a couple little quirky things to keep in mind. Think of it as kind of a brief crash course in some of these things. Probably the most important thing to wrap your head around is scope and hoisting. Closures might come a little bit later, but JavaScript can be a little funky, and hopefully this was a nice little introduction, right? I'm happy to take questions. I know we're over time and you guys want to go like eat and sleep or whatever, but if you do have questions, I'm happy to take them before we wrap.
You said you were gonna pick two of the things that were left. What was left?
I was just gonna give another example of a closure.
Oh,
I can still do it. It's not even like, it was just more to give an example and think about what it returned. But it's not that like intense because it's not like we're not even doing anything with the parent function scope. But I am going to declare a function called division. It's going to take in a number. And then it's a closure because it's going to return this little inner function. Right? It's going to take in a second number. Right? And what I want this little function to do is divide the two and return like the answer, the quotient. So it's going to return what I would get if I divided the first number by the second number, right? And then I just wanted to know, right, if I call this outer function 5, 6, I'm going to pass it in my, I think it's the divisor dividend. It's one of the two. The number on the top of the fraction bar, what we're dividing into. So I'm going to pass it 6, right? And then if I ran this, like, is that what I wanted? Yeah, that is. Like, what is this going to return, first off, right? When I call this function and pass it 6, what data type gets stored in divide 6 is what I want it to be called.
it's a function.
Yeah, it's a function, right? It's a weird concept to wrap your head around. I guess it's not going to show unless I is division 6. Do I have to console.log it? Okay, yeah, it's a function, right? So I just wanted to clear that up first because to me, that was a weird concept that you can return a function, but not like what it actually does. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke that function, divide 6, right? And pass it what I need for this inner function, right? num2. And I want to know, what is that going to return?
There's no number beside the number 2.
Oh, you're right. That would be helpful if I gave it a number. It was a trick question. I was just making sure you're paying attention.
Then it would return 2.
Yeah, it's going to return 2, right? So that was what the last example was. It was just another example of a closure, right? You'll see it takes a little getting used to, kind of wrapping your head around all of the different things. But this is kind of what I mean when I say that compared to Ruby, JavaScript is just a little bit weird. Takes some getting used to, right? Any other questions, folks?
So in essence, this module is going to be like the Ruby module was to Ruby on Rails. We'll do JavaScript and then get into React and Redux. The only reason I'm asking is because in my understanding, React is just a library of JavaScript stuff that you can use.
Yeah.
And I tried to look up like, well, what does that mean? And I couldn't get a clear answer because.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like, so in mod 1, you learn the fundamentals of Ruby, and then you learn 2 Ruby frameworks that handle both the front end and the back end stuff, right? Whereas here, we're learning a bunch of fundamentals of JavaScript, which is important just to know, period. JavaScript is like the language of the internet. HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Now, generally, when we use JavaScript, we're using it for front-end stuff. So for example, your mod 4 project is going to be a JavaScript front-end and a Rails back-end. So like Rails isn't going to go away. It's going to kind of go away for a little bit, and then it's going to come back, and then now you have to deal with 2 languages at once, and you'll question your life choices, right? And then in mod 5, you will learn about React, which is a front-end framework that's built in JavaScript. It's not the only one. There are other ones like Angular, but it's another front-end technology. So your mod 5, how many mods are there? There are 5. Your mod 5 project will have the front end built in React, managing some state stuff with Redux, and the back end will be Ruby, or Rails rather. So yes, but also it's kind of like bringing a lot of stuff together, it's not just a first half and a last half. It's all going to come together in some respects. Cool. All right. I feel like that's an appropriate place to close, but I will pause awkwardly for a last question. Also, Josh passed his assessment today, so let's be happy. All right, guys. We're over. I appreciate your time. You guys have a great night, okay?
Yeah.
All right.
All
Bye.
right. Thank you. Bye bye
You're
now.
welcome.
Good night.